The night my husband and his work friends decided to leave me alone in a town I couldn't pronounce, on a road I'd never seen before, in a country where I didn't speak the language, they were laughing. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the panic that set in when the taillights of the rental van disappeared around the curve, not the way my phone showed 4 bars of signal and still couldn't reach a single one of them. It's the laughing. I could hear it even after they were gone. We'd been arguing since lunch. That's not unusual. My husband and I had been arguing since roughly our 3rd year of marriage, which was also roughly the year I stopped having opinions he found worth hearing. This trip was supposed to fix something. I'm not sure what, exactly. A work retreat he'd been invited to extend into a vacation, partners welcome, and I was the partner who came along and apparently ruined the atmosphere by suggesting, after 6 hours of wine tasting in the Douro Valley, that maybe we should head back to the hotel before the roads got dark. She's always doing this, his colleague said. Not to me, to my husband. Right in front of me. My husband didn't correct him. That was the moment, I think, though I didn't have words for it yet. Before I even registered what was happening, everyone was piling back into the van, my husband included, and someone was saying something about getting a head start and the door slid shut and the engine turned over, and I was standing on a gravel shoulder in northern Portugal with my purse, my passport, thank God I'd kept it on me, and about 80 euros in cash. My credit cards were in the zip pocket of my husband's carry-on bag. He'd suggested consolidating before the trip. I'd thought it was practical. I stood there long enough for the dust to settle. Then I sat down on a low stone wall and let myself feel it, for exactly 3 minutes. I gave myself 3 minutes because if I didn't put a limit on it, I knew I'd still be sitting there when it got dark. Then I started walking toward the lights. The town was small enough that the single cafe was also the post office and, I would learn later, the informal community hub for about 200 people. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired, round-faced, the kind of person who looked like she'd seen everything and judged nothing, took one look at me and set down her dish towel. I don't know what she saw. My Portuguese was non-existent. Her English was 3 words, one of which was sit. So I sat. She brought me soup. I cried into it a little. She pretended not to notice. I called my husband's number 12 times before I accepted that it was going to voicemail. I called his colleague's number, which I had because we coordinated airport pickups. Voicemail. I worked through every contact I had from the trip. All of it, straight to voicemail, every time. By the 8th call, I understood this wasn't an accident or a miscommunication. This was a thing that had been decided. My sister would have wired me money without asking a single question. She would have had me on the first flight home from Porto with a glass of wine and a blanket waiting. I knew that. I stared at her name in my phone for a long time, but calling her meant explaining. Explaining meant hearing the particular silence she does when she's trying not to say something she's been sitting on for years. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to go back to Toronto and stand in my kitchen and have the conversation I'd been avoiding for the better part of a decade. The woman at the cafe let me use the back room to charge my phone and handed me a local bus schedule she'd laminated, which told me everything I needed to know about how often people ended up in exactly this situation. I looked at the schedule for a long time. Port U to the north, Lisbon to the south, and then, and I genuinely cannot explain this even now, I thought about a magazine article I'd read on the plane. About a village on the coast of southwestern Portugal, near Sagres, where the landscape was so stark and the light was so particular that artists had been going there for decades to reset. I had no reason to go there. I didn't know anyone. I had 80 euros and a dead phone. I bought a ticket for the southbound bus. I've asked myself many times since then what exactly I was running toward. I'm still not entirely sure. But I know what I was running from. The version of myself who would have called my husband again. Would have smoothed it over, accepted the apology that minimized what happened, and gotten back in the van. That version of me had been making herself smaller for a very long time. I could feel her getting ready to do it again. And something in me, quiet, certain, the way you know a tooth has gone bad before it actually starts hurting, said, not this time. The bus took 7 hours. I slept most of it. I arrived just after dawn, stiff and disoriented and startlingly hungry. The village was exactly what the article had described. Whitewashed buildings, fishing boats, the kind of silence that has texture. I found a cafe that was just opening and spent 4 euros on a coffee and a pastry and sat outside watching the light come up over the water. My phone had died again somewhere outside Setúbal, It was the most alone I'd felt in years. It was also the calmest. I found a room through a handwritten notice in the cafe window. A woman named Fernanda rented the apartment above her workshop for cash, weekly. It was small, one room, a bathroom, a window that looked out over a courtyard full of terracotta pots. The shower ran lukewarm at best. The mattress had opinions. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. Fernanda herself was somewhere in her late 60s, with the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with them, and the eyes of someone who knew exactly what you weren't saying. She made ceramic work, functional pieces mostly, cups and plates and the occasional decorative tile, and sold them through a cooperative in Sagres and to a handful of hotels in the Algarve. Her English was limited but sharp, deployed precisely when needed. My Portuguese was still nothing. We managed. On my third morning she found me sitting in the courtyard with a coffee, staring at my phone, charged now, full of messages I hadn't opened, and she set down a cup of something herbal on the table beside me and sat in the other chair without being asked. "Husband?" she said. She nodded at the phone. I said yes. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh and contained within it everything she thought about that subject, and then she stood up and jerked her head toward the workshop. "Come," she said. "I show you." I spent the morning watching her work. The wheel, the clay, the specific patience required to coax a shape out of something formless. She handed me a lump of clay and I made something that looked like a thumbprint wearing a hat. She said, in Portuguese, something I didn't understand and then translated it as, "The first ones are always honest." I came back the next day. And the day after that. I should tell you about the money, because this is where it gets complicated and also where the Canadian context matters in ways I hadn't anticipated. My husband and I had a joint account and two personal accounts. The joint account had our mortgage payments going out of it automatically, and I had a credit card linked to my personal account that had a $1,200 limit, enough for emergencies, not enough for a flight home from Lisbon in August. What I didn't know until I sat in that courtyard and finally opened my banking app was that he had transferred 60% of our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize 3 weeks before the trip. I'd received a notification at the time. I'd assumed it was a GIC renewal. I hadn't looked closely. I looked closely now. I'm not a forensic accountant, but I'd spent 11 years managing the household budget, which meant I understood our finances better than my husband assumed I did. What I was looking at was not an accident. I closed the app. I sat with that for a while. The terracotta pots in the courtyard were a very specific shade of orange in the morning light. Then I opened my email. There were 43 unread messages from my husband. The subject lines evolved from "call me" to "this is getting ridiculous" to "I spoke to a lawyer." There were 6 from my sister, escalating in a way that made my chest ache. There were 2 from my closest friend back home, the kind of friend who doesn't panic, which meant that when she panics, you know something is real. And there was one, almost buried, from a former colleague of mine, a landscape architect named, well, it doesn't matter. What mattered was the subject line, "Still open if you're interested." Before I quit my job 8 years ago, because my husband thought it would be easier, because we talked about starting a family, because I was tired of fighting for every project, and he made it sound so reasonable. I'd been a landscape architect. Mid-level, nothing extraordinary, but I'd been good at it. I'd had a specific eye for how spaces felt to move through, how to make a public garden feel private, a small balcony feel like an extension of something larger. My former colleague was working with a firm that consulted remotely for resort and hotel developments. She'd sent the first message 4 months ago. She'd sent 3 follow-ups. The most recent one from 2 weeks ago said, "Last chance, I think. They want someone by end of August." I read it 3 times. Then I went into the workshop and told Fernanda I needed to use her internet. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life in the most ordinary way. I was working, actually working, for the first time in 8 years, on a remote consulting contract that paid in Canadian dollars and required nothing from me but my judgment and my eye. I was also learning, slowly and badly and then less badly, how to throw a ceramic pot. Fernanda had a friend who spoke better English, a retired teacher named Dahlia, who started dropping by in the evenings and became, without ceremony, a kind of translator and companion. Through Dahlia he learned that Fernanda had had a daughter who'd emigrated to Canada, of all places, Vancouver, and rarely came back. That the workshop had been in the family for 3 generations. that Fernanda was not looking for someone to take it over but would not say no to extra hands during the busy season, I started helping with the kiln, then with packing orders. Then, because I apparently cannot stop myself from optimizing things, I noticed that her labeling system was inconsistent and her shipping costs were higher than they needed to be, and I spent a weekend rebuilding her pricing spreadsheet and finding her a better courier arrangement that saved her €40 a month. Boston lady brain, Fernanda said, which was not quite right geographically, but which I understood and accepted. The money from the consulting contract went into a new account I opened at a Portuguese bank. It wasn't a lot, it was mine. I cannot overstate how different those two things felt. I'd been there just over 4 months when I finally opened the message from my husband that I'd been skipping past, not the most recent ones, those I'd been reading, bracing myself, filing away. The one from the beginning, the one sent the morning after he'd left me on the side of that road. He called it a joke. He said I'd overreacted, that he'd assumed I'd call a cab, that it wasn't like he'd left me in the middle of nowhere. He said things had been tense and he'd needed space. He said I always made everything about myself. He said he'd waited 2 days before booking his flight home, giving me time to cool down. He said he'd expected me back by now. I sat with that one for a long time too. Dahlia found me on the courtyard steps that evening and sat beside me without asking. She had that quality, the ability to be present without requiring anything of you. I'd been crying without realizing it. You know, she said after a while, there's a word in Portuguese. Saudade. People explain it as longing, but I always think it means remembering what was never quite real. I thought about the version of my marriage I'd been trying to save for years, the version where my husband and I were partners, the version where he respected my work, my friendships, my ability to make a decision, the version where I wasn't always one disagreement away from being left on the side of the road. I need to talk to a lawyer, I said. Dahlia nodded. I know someone, she said. Her lawyer friend was a woman named, and this is going to sound like I made it up, Graça, which in Portuguese means grace, and she was exactly that. Calm, precise, and entirely without sentimentality. We met twice, with Dahlia translating. Graça connected me with a Canadian immigration lawyer by video call who explained what I needed to know about my rights under a long-distance divorce proceeding initiated from abroad. He was straightforward and not cheap and worth every cent of the consultation fee I'd been terrified to spend. I also called my sister. That conversation was long and hard and full of the silences I'd been dreading, and also full of things I hadn't expected. Her voice cracking when she said she'd been worried sick. The fact that she'd already spoken to a family lawyer friend of hers in Toronto. The information that my husband had, in the last few weeks, begun telling mutual acquaintances that I'd had a breakdown and run off. My sister's voice when she told me that was the sound of someone very carefully not swearing. What do you need from me? She asked. Can you hold on to some documents for me? I said. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I'd been in Portugal for 5 months when my husband sent the message that changed the register of everything. Not angry this time, not self-justifying. Efficient, he'd hired someone. I'd suspected as much. And he knew where I was. He was flying to Lisbon on a Thursday and renting a car, and he expected me to be ready to have a conversation. That was the word he used, expected. I read it at 7 in the morning, sitting in the workshop while the kiln ran its first cycle of the day, a cup of Fernanda's coffee cooling beside me. I showed it to Fernanda. She read it slowly. Her English was better than she let on. I'd come to understand. And then she set it down and looked at me with the expression she used when a student on the wheel was making a mistake she wasn't going to name just yet. She went to the back room and came out with a folder. We talk, she said, about the cooperative. The Southwest Artisan Cooperative was a formal legal structure, registered, taxed, revenue sharing that Fernanda had belonged to for 20 years. She wanted to formalize my role, not as an employee, as a contributing member, which meant profit sharing, decision-making rights, and a documented stake in the collective income. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was a practical arrangement that reflected what had actually been happening for months. The paperwork already existed in Dahlia's bag, it turned out. They'd been waiting for the right moment. Now is right moment, Fernanda said. We signed it that afternoon. I spent the next 2 days doing very practical things. I video called the Canadian lawyer again and walked through the divorce process step by step. I emailed the documents to my sister and to the family lawyer she'd found. I called my closest friend, The one who doesn't panic. And she listened to everything I'd been holding for 5 months and said, at the end, I always thought you were too much for him. I just couldn't figure out how to say it. I updated my professional profile online for the first time in 8 years. Thursday arrived the way difficult things do with perfect weather. I was in the workshop when I heard the car pull up on the gravel, an unfamiliar sound in a village where everyone walked or rode bikes. Fernanda appeared in the doorway and looked at me. You want me to stay? She said. Yes, I said, but you don't have to say anything. I wiped my hands on my work apron and walked outside. He looked the way people look when they've rehearsed something, put together, composed, slightly too certain. He'd rented a sedan and was standing beside it the way men stand when they're trying to look like they're not nervous. He had on the jacket I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago. I don't know why I noticed that. I noticed it. He saw me and something shifted in his face. I've thought about what that shift was, and I think it was the specific disorientation of encountering someone you thought you knew and finding that the coordinates have moved. I was tanned, my hair was shorter, Dahlia's neighbor cut hair, and I'd finally gotten around to it. I was wearing clothes that fit the person I was now rather than the person I'd been performing in Toronto. I was not, in any visible way, someone who'd been waiting. This is... He started. He stopped. He tried again. You look different. I live here now, I said. Come sit down if you want to talk. We sat in the courtyard. Fernanda brought out 2 cups of coffee and then positioned herself in the workshop doorway, quietly, without comment. He didn't seem to know what to make of her. He started with the reasonable version. He missed me. The house was strange without me in it. He'd had time to think and he knew things hadn't been right between us and he wanted to fix it. His voice had the cadence of someone who'd done well in negotiations before and expected to do well again. I let him finish. Why did you look for me? I asked. He seemed thrown by the question. Because you're my wife. It's been 5 months, I said. You stopped calling after 2 weeks. You called your friends to check on me once, and they reported back that I'd left the hotel region entirely. You hired someone a month ago. What changed? He shifted in his seat. The sunlight was hitting the courtyard in a way that left nowhere to hide. People were asking questions, he said. Friends, your colleagues from before. My firm's equity partner asked me directly at dinner last month where you were. It was becoming a problem, I said. I was going to say complicated. It was a problem for your reputation, I said. Not for you. You weren't worried about me. You were worried about what it looked like. He didn't deny it. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't been able to see clearly before. It had never been about me, not the Italy comparison people would draw. We weren't in Italy, but the pattern underneath it. I had been, for 11 years, a component of a life he was building for an audience. When I stopped being a flattering component, I became a problem. I can't go back, I said. He asked me to reconsider. Then he told me I was being dramatic. Then he told me I didn't understand what I was giving up. Then, and this was the one that surprised me, he told me he'd been lonely. I believed that part. I believed it and I felt sorry for it, and feeling sorry for it did not change anything. I reached into my apron pocket and put the envelope on the table. These were filed through a Canadian firm last week, I said. My sister has the originals. Your copy will come by registered mail. Your lawyer already knows. There are provisions for the assets. I've gone through them carefully. The financial transfers you made before the trip are documented. He stared at the envelope the way people stare at things they've decided are not real. You can't be serious, he said. I am, I said. You'd give up everything, our home, our everything we built, for this? He gestured at the courtyard, the pots, the workshop, the very specific smallness of the life he was looking at. You're a landscape architect. You went to university for 6 years. You were good at it. I am good at it, I said. I took a consulting contract 4 months ago. I've been working remotely the whole time I've been here. You assumed I wasn't capable of that without you. That assumption is part of why I'm not coming back. That one landed. I watched it land. Fernanda appeared then, not intrusively. She just stepped into the courtyard with a tray she was clearly going to take inside, and the timing was perfect. And my husband looked at her and then at me. And I think he understood, finally, that he was not here to negotiate. He was here to be informed. He left before sunset. He took the envelope. He drove his rental sedan back down the coastal road without another word, and I stood in the courtyard and watched the dust settle after him. And it felt nothing like victory and everything like relief. That evening, Fernanda made dinner, a fish stew that smelled like the sea, and Dahlia came by and we ate at the table in the workshop and talked about everything except what had just happened, which was exactly what I needed. Around 9 o'clock, walking back to my apartment, I stopped in the courtyard and looked up. The sky out here was a different quality of dark than Toronto, more stars than you'd think possible. I thought about the woman I'd been on that gravel shoulder in the Douro Valley, how certain she'd been that she was ruined, how small the set of options had seemed. I thought about my sister, who'd said yes before I finished asking. My friend, who'd said I was too much for him and meant it kindly. Dahlia, who'd brought the right lawyer. Fernanda, who'd handed me clay on my third morning and said the first ones are always honest. I went inside and opened my laptop and answered 3 work emails, and then I looked at my calendar for the week, Kielm's schedule, cooperative meeting, a call with a resort development team in the Azores who'd found my profile and wanted to talk about a garden consultation. It was not the life I'd planned. It was the life that had opened up quietly in the space left behind by the one I'd been maintaining. He had left me on that road assuming I would fall apart. He had assumed 11 years of depending on him had left me incapable of anything else. He had been wrong, and what I felt about that was not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter, the particular clarity of knowing your own weight. Some things can only be learned the way I learned them, not in spite of what was done to you. Because of it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that evening in the courtyard, watching my husband's rental car disappear down the coast road, not in any grand or abstract sense, just the plain mechanics of it. He made a choice. That choice set off a chain of things he didn't intend and couldn't predict. And every link in that chain was mine. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. The same event that was meant to humiliate me became the exact condition I needed to find out what I was actually capable of. He left me on the side of a road assuming I would fall apart. He had 11 years of evidence that I deferred to him, that I softened my edges to keep the peace, that I had built my daily life around the shape of his preferences. From where he was standing, that probably looked like dependence. What he didn't know, what I didn't fully know, was that it had been a choice. A long, slow, increasingly costly choice. And choices can be unmade. Fernanda used to say, when a piece came out of the kiln wrong, that the clay always tells the truth. You can mask things in the shaping, but the heat reveals what was actually there. I think about that a lot. I think 5 months in a village in Portugal, with no income and no plan and no one's expectations to manage, was a kind of heat. What it revealed was that I hadn't lost myself in that marriage. I'd just set myself down somewhere convenient and walked away from the shelf. Dahlia once asked me if I was angry. We were walking back from the market carrying bags that were too heavy because we both overbought, and she asked it the way she asked most things, directly, without preamble, as if the question had been in the room for a while and she was just naming it. I thought about it honestly. Not anymore, I said. I was. Now I'm mostly just clear. She nodded like that was the right answer. Maybe it was. Anger is useful when it moves you. It moved me onto a southbound bus when everything in me wanted to curl up on that gravel shoulder. But you can't build a life out of it. At some point you have to put it down and pick up something else. What I picked up was clay, first, and then a consulting contract, and then a cooperative agreement with a woman who'd never asked for anything from me except honest work. What I picked up was the phone call to my sister that I'd been avoiding for a decade. What I picked up was the version of my professional self I'd set on that shelf and quietly walked away from 8 years ago. Graça told me, in our second meeting, that the legal process would take time, but that the documentation was solid. You've done the hard part, she said. She meant the paperwork. I understood her to mean something larger. The hard part, as I've come to see it, was not surviving being left on that road. Plenty of people survive difficult things without changing anything. The hard part was choosing not to go back to a life that had been slowly, politely, reasonably making me smaller. The hard part was recognizing that I had participated in that, not as a victim, but as someone who had made accommodations that seemed sensible at the time and added up, over 11 years, to a kind of erasure. I'm not the same person who sat down on that stone wall and gave herself 3 minutes to fall apart. I'm not sure I'd want to be. What happened in Portugal? The work, the kiln, the courtyard dinners, Fernanda's unsentimental patience, Dahlia's precision, the first consulting payment landing in an account that belonged only to me. None of it was what I planned. All of it was necessary. Some doors only open from the outside. Sometimes someone else pushes you through one, thinking they're leaving you behind. The work is what you do once you're on the other side.